much does a cruise ship cost? Anyone? £1 billion? Half a billion? Half a billion, maybe it's dollars. $500 million. Okay. So their business is having these really big and expensive things which they rent out to cruise customers. So it's like a hotel, it's a floating hotel. The hotel company, the assets are the physical building, and the income is, people rent your room. And the costs are some of the things that we've just talked about. So we can get a feeling for the business model just by thinking about how the cruise company runs. So would you invest in... Okay, so as well as being the largest publicly listed company in Southampton, Carnival is the biggest cruise company in the world with about 50% of all cruise traffic. So there's other companies, I'm talking about cruise traffic, not freight traffic, not shipping. Those would be different market sectors, but the cruise bit of the shipping industry, Carnival owns about 50%. So would you invest in a cruise company? How profitable is it? Sorry? How profitable is it? Then how profitable is it? It's a good question. So now you have to look on a finance website or read that 100-page company report. Right. So you'd probably be a bit reluctant to invest in a cruise company because you don't have much feeling for how a business like that works. So it's difficult to say, I trust Carnival, they're a good company, etc. What about Microsoft or Apple? Well, let's make this a three-way thing. You've got this £100,000. Your stock market advisor has told you, no, just put it in one company. Never mind all this rubbish about portfolios. Sack them, it's bad advice. But imagine you're only going to invest in one company. Will you pick Carnival, Microsoft, or Apple? And I want you all to put up your hands. Which of those three would be your first choice to invest in? Who would go for Carnival Cruise Company based in Southampton? Okay, two. Who would go for Microsoft? Okay, and who would go for Apple? Okay, so this year Microsoft is slightly more popular than Apple, which is different because previously Apple has been more popular than Microsoft. So why is Apple not popular this year?
They've been preferring to Steve Jobs side. The Apple Watch and the iPhone 7 were both underwhelming, so they're starting to run out of ideas and stagnate.
So who agrees that Apple has started to run out of ideas? Okay. Who thinks that Microsoft are running out of ideas? Okay. So if you criticize Apple for running out of ideas, why would you buy Microsoft instead? Microsoft.
Microsoft's products tend to be somewhat more functional and in less competitive markets, I'd say.
Okay, so they're operating in a less competitive market.
Yeah, but Apple has most of the profits. Like if you
Apple has most of the profit. Yeah.
But the market is actually...
And the market is saturated. Yeah. So maybe we should be going for the cruise company if these are all... Okay. So the reason you invest in a company is because you anticipate future profit. So it's not really relevant what their profit is at the moment unless you think, oh, it's going to carry on like that for 5-10 years. So you have to look at the current profit and the prospects of that company, and for something like Apple, it probably depends on future products. So you could criticize them for saying there isn't a good pipeline of future products. But something like a cruise company, probably they can just carry on doing the same thing and doing it reasonably well, and they'll carry on making the same profit. So maybe the cruise company is a more reliable investment because they don't have to worry about competition and a pipeline of new products. All right. Well, okay. So that was a first lecture, and it took a little bit longer than I thought, but then we had some dialogue, and I hope you've kind of learned a little bit about thinking about finance in a business perspective, from a business perspective. So finance and business, investing, why it is that publicly listed companies are the engines of wealth, but also companies like Apple, and McDonald's, and Carnival P&O, they have changed the world because of their businesses. And I only have to look every year, and I can just see how popular Apple laptops are, at least in this sector. You know, clearly Apple has made a huge difference to a lot of people's lives. So when people say, "Oh, I want the world to be a better place," one way of making the world a better place is to make a successful company that changes the world, and then you get rich. So you can do both. You can do both. So how is a company run? How does a company make decisions? So that's what this is about. So inside most companies there would be a number of directors, some of whom are employed by the company and some of whom are just external and only come to sit on the board of directors. So there'd be a mix of internal and external directors. The internal director would be the chair of the board. Other internal directors might be, the independent directors might include the chair of the board. The CEO might be an internal director and may be different from the chair. CEO, Chief Executive Officer, CFO, Chief Financial Officer, other executives. And there may be a shareholder or two as board members. And one of the responsibilities in a company set up like this is to appoint and terminate the Chief Executive Officer. Okay. The board, as well as that, establishes the policy and strategic objectives. What are we trying to do as a company to serve our customers better? Who are our customers? How do we serve them better? Have we got the money we need to achieve our goals, to invest, to build new cruise ships, to make new Apple products? How are we going to spend the money this year, manage the cash flow, and write and sign off on that annual report? The structure of a charity is similar, except you tend to talk about trustees rather than directors. But a charity or non-profit organisation would have some kind of board, they'd have policy, strategy, finances, and accountable to the stakeholders, like the major donors to that charity. So some structure like this, in a large company, board of directors separate, chair, an independent external, different from the chief executive officer, who the management report to, depending on the sector. There might be regulators, universities got higher education regulations from taken into account. If you're making consumer electronics, you mustn't electrocute people or set fire to their batteries, etc. So there'll be product regulations. You're running ships, and there'll be shipping regulations. The auditors check the accounts, shareholders receive the dividends. And the main committees that feed in, like risk, compensation, and the internal people who don't worry about the audit. Now, companies do fail, so though it's true on average, investing in companies is a big win, you might invest in the wrong company. So there's examples of companies that have failed, even ones which were previously Fortune 100. And that means the top 100 companies in the US identified by the Fortune magazine, normally on the basis of their stock market price. So the total price of the company from the top 100 in the US, you're a Fortune 100 company. So some big companies, a lot of investors, a lot of shares, a lot of people have put money into those companies. Some of them occasionally go bankrupt, others occasionally fizzle out and lose their position in the top 100. So General Motors, for example, at one point was the top car manufacturer, but failed to change with the time. They thought the people in the States liked buying big cars, they focused on that and didn't switch to smaller, more ecologically friendly cars, and lost market share. Motorola was a very successful consumer electronics business, but didn't move with the time as mobile phone telephony developed. Kodak was a famous camera company, and people say, oh, well, they didn't predict digital cameras. And actually, it's more complicated than that, because they did research. They produced prototype digital cameras. It's just that they didn't decide to change their business strategy. They could have moved into digital cameras, but then they said, oh, but we're making all this profit from traditional cameras. So they left that to competitors. So sometimes an established business may find it difficult to switch to newer technologies when it should do. And that's one of the difficult decisions for the board of a company. When is it time to switch? Sometimes there's just recklessness. Companies can borrow money. They're a legal entity. They have bank accounts. They can borrow money and take on debt. Some companies do that to excess, and then they can't cope with the interest payments. And sometimes a company might change too quickly to a new product. Firestone was a famous brand of tyre, switched, and it turned out the new tyres weren't very reliable, and that was a big damage to that company, and sometimes people inside the company, it's not just recklessness, but it's greed and fraud. They siphon off money to their own advantage, and the company suffers and may go bankrupt and disappear altogether. Okay. So the board is important for deciding the big picture, what is the company going to do? And I mentioned Enron, but at that time there were a number of other companies that were found to be rather poorly run. So in the States they passed an act that strengthened accounting and board responsibilities. So when the board sign off, they are making themselves personally and legally liable, and the directors can be sent to prison if the statements in the company report are found to be false. So what that means is that these days, company reports tend to have quite a lot of little footnotes. But this might go wrong. We believe this is a situation, but it might be the case that so they're defending themselves against criticism and against the impact of this new act. We want you to be very clear, these are the risks to our business. So we'll write 20 pages about all the risks to our business. It doesn't really make the company report easier to read. And this was in response to a previous scandal, around the scandal. The same thing happened slightly different ways around 2008, and again that led to a big global financial crisis. So, as well as protecting the board and the shareholders, making sure the company is run sensibly, the board has to manage the conflicts of interest between the various stakeholders. The employees want to be well paid, they want a decent job. The shareholders want a company that's successful and making profits and returning dividends. The customers want good products, they want good service, and they don't want to have to pay too much. So a successful company has to balance all those different perspectives from the various stakeholders. And there's a bit of an incentive these days for the executive to run a company so that for a year or two it's really profitable. Cut out as much expenses, inflate the price as much as possible, rely on your brand and your customer loyalty, but don't continue to provide the same level of service. For a year or two, you can get away with that, and then you might get good profit for that year or two. The share price goes up, the executives can claim bonuses because they've made good profit and the share price has gone up, but they've damaged the longer term interest, and a lot of the shareholders, like pension funds, tend to invest for 5 or 10 years. So how do you balance these conflicts of interest? And make sure that the reports are clear and fair and everything necessary has been disclosed about that business, and that decisions are made that are rational, ethical and responsible. So, not surprisingly, following all the problems with those companies, this was a line of research, and people wrote books and articles about the decision quality within company boards. And in a well-run company, the board gets to approve or reject a proposal to the CEO. I mean, some companies are still a little bit traditional, and instead the CEO says, this is what we're doing, and the board says, oh, that sounds fine, get on with it, you know, and the board is just there to rubber stamp. But because of that Sarbanes-Oxley or SOX Act, that's no longer enough, certainly in the States, because the board are then putting themselves at risk of prosecution if it turns out the CEO has been lying or reckless or committing fraud. So in a well-run company, the board should add value by making sure they understand what they're signing up to and agreeing to, making sure strategy for the year ahead is appropriate, deciding when it's reasonable to delegate or to reserve powers in the board, and having a discussion about those decisions. And it's tricky to make decisions because there are these conflicting objectives and different criteria that you have to consider when making company strategy decisions. So you have various criteria, and one way of making decisions is to produce a decision matrix and give each criterion a weighting, and then come up with a view as to how good or bad each decision is. And then do some computation using a weighted average. And the good thing about this method is that it's systematic. So that if ever the executives are challenged, why did you make that decision? They're not going to say, oh, the CEO told us it would be a good thing. Or, oh, we used our gut instinct. You know, we read in the newspaper the other day that Apple doesn't have a good product pipeline, so we thought we won't invest in Apple. You know. No, we use these criteria. This is our supporting evidence. This is the reason we made that decision. So they've made defensible decisions, and that's important if there's any legal action. Of course, it's not perfect, but then it's difficult to predict the future, and indeed, that's why it's difficult to run a company perfectly. Well, it's not possible to run a company perfectly. It's difficult to run it well. And for example, if you were to be making a decision about whether you want to be a developer, project manager, contractor, consultant, probably you would have a number of criteria that you would take into account, not just the autonomy, whether you work for yourself, what are the earnings, what's the security, I didn't put that down. There are a whole list of criteria, and then you could put in a number in each of these, and then multiply by the weights and divide and get an average. And that would be a way of making that decision about your career. Right. I don't think we've got time to do that, but I think that is